In order to improve your poetry, you need to hold yourself to a standard. That's what I've always been saying throughout this whole time on this channel, video after video. Heck, even if you don't believe like I do that poetry has some universal better and worse, you still at least need some personal better and worse. Something more evolved than if it feels good, which is just a fancy term for masturbation. You can likely predict what my usual advice would be, again, if you've been following along, which is read more poetry. And yeah, in the long term, that will probably get you sorted. But sometimes people bounce right back up to me in my face and they come at me and they say, well, Max, I've been reading some poetry. Max, I've been trying. But when I read a great poem, I can't tell whether it's good or bad. What now, tough guy? Well, settle your tea kettle. This vid is here to help. I'm going to break down for you the two dominant frames in criticism today, so you can start to understand how the pros read a poem and how quality is assessed. Now, these two paradigms are vastly simplified. Whew. What's not simplified is my enunciation. I don't really think there are only two schools of literary criticism, but I do think most people listening are going to tend to fall under one camp or another, right? Let's start with deconstruction. Deconstruction, its core concept is that text is a deliberate social idea. It's made up. It's like this lie we participate in when we go to read a poem. So when you read and interpret a poem from the text, you must account for this artificialness. And ultimately, you must dismantle the assumptions that go into that. Now, this is a very, very fundamentally French idea from Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. And it's had a huge influence on academic life that started in the 80s and has gone on pretty strong ever since. Now, you might ask yourself, how do I know if this is kind of where I land and how I should approach things? Should I be reading some deconstruction to understand this better? Well, I'd say you can just ask yourself some of these questions. If you're nodding along to a lot of these, I'd say, well, you're probably team deconstruction. If you prefer strategy over tactics, if you love the sense of play that occurs when a poem breaks conventions, if you're okay or even prefer poems that don't complete, if you think great poetry is more about ideas and less about technique, if you're pretty sure that poetry isn't generalizable across poems, meaning that each and every poem kind of has to just start over from a technique perspective, so you can't kind of carry over technique endlessly. If you're skeptical about formal verse produced after modernism, and you just think, well, why would anyone want to write formal verse anymore? If you don't miss the canon and think the whole idea of the canon was pretty dumb, and you prefer to look forward and find outsiders, and if you do look back, you prefer to look for outsiders from the past and forge new traditions, all of those things would tend to push you towards team deconstruction. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I would say there's new criticism. Now, new criticism, I don't mean the strict, narrow sense of a new criticism from John Crow Ransom or Clanth Brooks. I'm talking about this kind of New York school of public intellectuals, imagined largely, that descend from this new criticism rubric. So I would include someone like Lionel Trilling, who wrote this essay, which you should all read, called The Liberal Imagination. I'd include this guy who I've talked about before, Jed Pearl, who wrote this little book, Authority and Freedom. That's great. There's a lot out there. Any rate, how do you know if this is your team, right? So the core concept to new criticism is you're approaching a poem on its own terms, right? You honor the text itself and its intentions and not the poet's. Big surprise, it's kind of how I troll, right? Each and every poem that I troll, I'm pretty much taking a new criticism approach. You know you're a new critic if you prize clarity of language and thought. If you believe craftsmanship is the fundamental element of style. If the idea that certain works from certain earlier eras are difficult, if not impossible to surpass, seems obvious to you. If you can understand why someone would want to write formal verse today and may take a crack at it yourself. If you have no problem with the idea of canon and feel certain works are rightly canonical, even if you understand in practical purposes in 2023, for all intents and purposes, the canon isn't super workable. So, taking a step back, you can see that these two theories of quality and how they evaluate a poem and read a poem are at odds. In New Crit, any text can be compared to any other on its merits, and it makes it pretty easy to measure. But in Deconstruction, a poem actually isn't really a text because a text is a social construct. So quality is really a measurement of a poem's ability to destabilize, to undercut our expectation and norms and reframe the discourse, right? And if it's not completely and totally obvious to you, I'm kind of new crit in my approach. But I respect my enemy, and I appreciate it's impossible to follow 20th century and 21st century poetry and culture in general without some knowledge of deconstruction. And I personally strongly prefer the new crit approach because it's straightforward, it focuses on clarity of thought and language, and it acknowledges that whatever we try to do today has likely already been tried before, which I think is probably pretty accurate. I also like the new crit approach because it's zero mumbo jumbo. There's no advanced. It's all basics, no matter what. There's no secret inside stuff. You just do the hard work, right? So stating my priors and my biases, my perspective, should make it easier for you to decide how you want to engage and move forward. That's what I always try to bring to the table. Radical openness means radical possibilities. Even if you don't agree, we can still generate new ideas together. So think carefully about what you want your poems to achieve and stop working in the dark. Follow the YouTube channel that will best help you fulfill your poetry goals.